we've got Stephan, John Carvalho, Ben Ark, Bitcoin Mechanic, and Sjors Provoost. Please, everybody, big round of applause.
All right. First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for, and thanks to the organizers for inviting us. We're going to get straight into it. We're going to be talking about Bitcoin development philosophy and, of course, this idea of slow and steady. Is that the way, or is there some other idea? So we're going to jump right into it. Let's get each panelist to maybe spell out if you had an idea that you identify with, or how would you categorize yourself in terms of Bitcoin development philosophy?
So I would say, when it comes to protocol development, I'm a Bitcoin conservative, user advocate, and builder advocate.
Yeah, I would say I'm pretty conservative when it comes to development. It's important to define Bitcoin, isn't it? So are we talking Bitcoin on-chain? Are we talking Bitcoin on the second layers and everything else which makes up Bitcoin, like eCash, whatever else? So I live on the Lightning Network, more or less, and that's where I do all my development. So that's my primary focus. So when it comes to developing on the Lightning Network, I prefer a faster pace, but yeah, with on-chain, more of a slower pace, I would say.
I think it depends too much on what it is we're talking about. I decline to give a simple answer to that.
Okay, fair enough. Sjors?
Then I will agree with all three previous speakers, just to be even more vague. No, I think when you're making protocol changes, you have to be super careful because once you introduce a bug, you're stuck with it. Even if the bug is non-fatal, like you might have to build workarounds for the next 200 years. Or 2,000 years. So we should be careful, but at the same time, I think there are plenty of things that need to be improved in Bitcoin. So I'm very much in favor of doing those things. And I think it's not about like how many weeks should it take. It's just people hours looking at code, and that's where is a massive bottleneck.
Yeah. So
it could happen really quickly if there's like 100 very talented people looking at things. But in general, there is one proposal. Like there's 20 people with 20 different proposals. And there's 2 people looking at each of them, or less, and it just doesn't move.
Yeah, okay. So look, the title, let's get to the title. The title of the panel is Slow and Steady, and so this is after, I guess, named after a blog post that circulated around in Bitcoin circles by AJ Towns, Bitcoin core developer. So can I get each of you to just kind of react to that? Do you have any thought on that? Do you like the post, not like the post? Any reactions?
I'd say my impression of the post is it seems kind of like a passive-aggressive way to promote progressiveness, but there's a lot in there. It tries to also summarize things. So I don't know. I think that there is a progressive movement going on right now, and it's nice to have something called slow and steady. I don't know if that was the message of the post per se, but yeah, I do think we have to be very careful with adding complexity, no matter how simple the complexity might seem.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just butting up against actual scaling issues, like when we have actual volume in Bitcoin and then fees reach a point which, well, they start to go up in value, which we all knew was going to happen, we talked about. But the reality is that no one actually tackles scaling or tackles anything really until it's critical, which is a shame. But that's just the reality, human nature, isn't it? So look at what we do to our environment, it's the same. So yeah, it's something we desperately need to do to tackle scaling, but it's something which you don't do until it's the nth hour, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what it is you're responding to. Again, it depends. If there are issues, they need to be fixed as quickly as possible, because and again, it depends on what the issue is. If the issue is something that's being facilitated to happen on chain. And the longer it goes on, the worse it is for the rest of all time, or for as long as Bitcoin remains what it is, or has the role it has to our species. If there's bullshit ending up inside the chain, and it's clearly a violation of whatever influences everything that happens, it's all ultimately downstream of what the community want, right? If that's happening, and there isn't really a response to it that's expedient, it creates a problem that the longer it persists, the longer you have to deal with this thing that is this lump in Bitcoin's history that will exist and is enshrined forever. Like, because you have everything that ends up in the chain is its own form of ossification in a way, right? Like, if it's 8,000 blocks ago, it's there, and if that contains some sort of troll transaction that takes a node a disproportionately long time to process because it was just had a deliberately annoying script in it, like something of that nature, that's there forever. You're not going to rewrite it. So if stuff like that is happening, and that's hopefully just hypothetical at the moment, then quickly, let's fix it. Other things, it depends, right? The covenants is obviously the elephant in the room at the moment. Are we going to add something like that? In what capacity are we going to add it? With what degree of urgency are we going to add it? It depends. I think my contention here is mainly just there are always unforeseen things that can happen with any upgrade. Certainly, I was like a massive proponent of SegWit. I was a massive proponent of Taproot. And in both cases, things happened that I didn't foresee. And so I feel stupid looking back on it, going, I was pushing and pushing and pushing for something that I didn't fully understand. And rather than be too critical of myself, go, that probably applies to everyone else as well. No matter how good CTV might appear, or OpCat, or the combination of CTV with CSFS, or TX hash, or any of these things, there's going to be something we didn't expect about it. And it might be something really stupid that people go, don't worry about that. Why would people start investing money in cat JPEGs uploaded in the blockchain? Guess what? Stupid things like that have really bad ramifications. And then if there's, I'm sort of going off on one here, but if there's a lack of interest in the greater community about addressing the kind of issues that come from that, then it becomes really a frightening context to start adding a bunch of opcodes, especially when we've got the great script restoration. Like, this is just, I mean, it's just so, there's a naivety that comes with saying, don't worry, we can add all this, and it's harmless. Like, there are always unknown unknowns, right? Yeah. So this is not, it's not an advocate. Like, by the same token, there can be bugs that need to be fixed at the same time, and you need to fix them, and rather than take a passive approach. So it's, I can't have one position or the other and say we should just be slow or fast. That's why I say it depends.
So let me come back to, we'll come back to the GSR thing, and I think there's kind of a steel man, which we'll get into that. But let's first hear from Sjors. You, out of this panel, let's note Sjors is the actual Bitcoin Core developer, so I think you probably have the best insight into how at least yourself and maybe some of the other developers are seeing it. Maybe any reactions on the slow and steady idea? Yeah, well, let's go there.
It's also maybe useful to address a misconception that all the Bitcoin Core developers are thinking about soft forks all day, and it's almost the opposite, because you get, at least in my experience, you get bogged down in so many details of just maintaining a piece of software, of things that do not require a soft fork, also because, you know, those things you can build immediately, you don't have to wait for people, that a lot of people are not paying attention to any of these soft forks, but in order to get those soft forks through, people do need to review it. And this can create some friction where advocates of a certain soft fork might say, why doesn't Bitcoin Core look at my soft fork? But there is no Bitcoin Core, right? There's just individual developers with their own interests, and they're looking like, I could fix this bug, or I could add this cool feature right now, or I could find out which of the 16 Covenant proposals is worth spending a month looking at. So part of the problem is, I think, just not having too many different ideas, but you can't tell people to not have different ideas. I'm not sure.
Okay. So, all right, go on.
Can I push back on that a little? I find that to be one of those things that should be the case, but isn't really the case in practice. Like, to say there is no Bitcoin Core is sort of a denial of the reality of how politics is just anything that involves multiple people. Like, Bitcoin is like we want to be technological rather than political, but the reality of it is there is a small group of people that are intercommunicating and and if this was one of the criticisms that I didn't agree with that people threw at us about Taproot, saying, oh, because Peter Wuller is the guy behind it, it just sort of sails through without any, issues. And then Jeremy Rubin and the people that are pushing for CTV or L-Enhance are saying, if this was Peter Wuller pushing it, it would go through in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And
so Sjors, would you agree or disagree? Do you think that's true?
I guess there's two things. There's definitely a group of developers working on Bitcoin Core that do talk to each other. So there is a network that you can probably identify, but it is not a decision-making organ. So it cannot come together and have a meeting and say, we will take this soft fork and not this other soft fork. So I guess it's more of a, yeah, like you can't tell Bitcoin Core to look at your soft fork in that sense. But I'm not denying the existence of a group of people, basically. I think your other point, I forgot your other point here.
I'm just saying it's like a sort of the well-oiled, the well-trodden pathway.
Oh,
If you
the
pushed a Zeph-
SEPA argument,
yeah.
yes. So I think there is an actual difference between the like quality or details of the Taproot proposal versus the CSV. So it's not just because it's SEPA, it's also because SEPA produces, like, you know, he's got a lot of experience, so he thinks about all the details and caveats. So I think the proposal was also in better shape, and it did get a lot of review. Like there were Taproot workshops in multiple cities, people going through like I went through the whole proposal in like this Python simulator. So there's that. But there may still be some, even if the proposals were completely equal, it's possible that one person gets their proposal through faster than another, just based on social dynamics. I think that's definitely possible.
Yeah, well, let's being like realistic about it again. Like 99% of people evaluating soft forks are doing it based on social heuristics. That has to be the case, right?
Yes.
Like, so if someone that is
At least at first, I would say at first glance. So if two random people send me an email, say titled "New soft fork, please look at it," if that email comes from SEPA or that email comes from a random person I don't know, I'll look at SEPA's proposal. But if SEPA's proposal is, oh, we're going to hard fork the blockchain and make 20 terabyte blocks, then I'm like, you went insane. Sorry.
Yeah.
Whereas if this new person, eventually you'll see it. So I do think the content matters. But at the first instance, the social network also matters.
Yeah,
Okay, so let's you guys are kind of dominating the conversation. Let's get a bit more from John and Ben here. But let's discuss this idea from, okay, so in 2017, we made this choice around block size. And I guess now there's a bit more of a conversation around if the fees and the usage were to really rise again, what are people going to do? Are people just going to go custodial? Or maybe like John, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe maybe if the fees rise enough, maybe that's going to be an argument for a block size increase, that kind of maybe long term. What do you see being the community response to these kinds of things if we were to get a sudden wave of adoption?
Oh, I think it's interesting that they were specifically talking about the Bitcoin core culture and the politics within it, and they used the word social consensus. But that's a little bit, bigger than what is actually happening. It's a social consensus within Bitcoin core enthusiasts and participants, right?
Yeah, subset.
And none of that is about users, right? There aren't users that are really worried about covenants. There aren't even many builders that are very worried about it. And so I think we have to have a context for when we are just doing progressive speculation for Bitcoin, and that's really when the danger comes in. Mechanic mentioned himself that looking back on supporting some of these soft forks, some aspects are regrettable. And in the end, what are the significant things that we've done adding soft forks to Bitcoin that have actually affected Bitcoiners since 2017? Well, the effective block size increase of SegWit, the malleability fix to make Lightning easier to use, and that's it. Taproot has had no significant impact on end users. It has, other than negative impact, making things, making the ordinal stuff easier to do. So I think we have to go back and say maybe it should be more market-driven than engineer-driven because one is speculative and one is prescriptive.
Ben, anything to add?
I think we'll probably just whatever solution we end up with will probably just be the thing which fixes the problem. And the problem we have currently is that fees will go up on chain, and that we want more. Depending on how you look at Bitcoin, maybe some people might be perfectly happy with that. Some millionaire who just wants to store their Bitcoin in cold storage, and they want Bitcoin just to stay exactly as it is, and they don't care about the high fee. They'll happily pay it. But personally, I want Bitcoin to be used for payments throughout the world, and for everyone to have access to this free and open source money. And I think that's very important, and we do that through second layer. And that's, like you say, in 2017, we decided that was the way in which we were going to scale Bitcoin, but we may have changed our opinion now, and some people might just want to, increase the blockchain and do things on-chain, and they still want to have that on-chain footprint in the same way which they had traditionally. I think Bitcoin for a lot of us, it's our little universe, and the concept of changing anything is quite scary. And then there's this idea that when you do change, you have all these unknowns, but then inaction also has unknowns in not doing anything, that you're not adding extra available throughput into the Bitcoin stack, so you can have those transactions. So I'm a fan of fixing scaling. I think that's the most important thing. Making it possible so we can have things like channel factories. When we had Lightning, it was assumed that we would have channel factories, and no one really worked on it. Like a handful of people worked on channel factories, and God bless them, because they were, no one cared that they weren't. But now there is more attention on actually creating channel factories, because as soon as you have, really small on-chain fees as soon as you can create multiple channels with one on-chain transaction, a couple of on-chain transactions. If you make channel creation and curation very, very cheap, then the Lightning Network works a lot better than it does.
I just wanted to quickly address, you also mentioned me as large block space, and I'll put it in context and I'll say that complexity, the evidence that complexity, particularly things like UTXO sharing, channel factories, even Lightning, the evidence is pretty lacking, in my opinion, as that we know that we can scale through adding complexity. I think that Lightning definitely has a utility. I think that sharing UTXOs in general can have utility. I think that covenants can have utility. I think that the degree to which it can solve and relieve the fee problems and solve problems for end users is vastly overstated, and we have a lot to prove there before we repeat it again. Because until I see something like the complexity of Lightning actually helping many, many Bitcoin users, it's hard to say, oh yeah, and I would support, let's also do covenants so we can have UTXO sharing and so we can have channel factories. We can't get people to reliably use 2 people in a channel, and now we think we're going to get many in there. I'm highly skeptical, and I wouldn't take that risk.
For the sake of argument, let me try and present a bit of a steel man here, though, because some people would say, actually part of the reason Lightning and some of these other concepts like ARC and so on can't work, this is their argument, is that without sufficiently advanced L1, let's say, opcodes, that these things could be done without interactivity. Like, so as an example, ARC is better with CTV. That's their argument, right? So isn't there something to that? What do you guys think?
I would say that something like Lightning, that on-chain isn't the optimal layer to sit below Lightning as a protocol. That something else which allows something where you can have cheap channel creation, maybe a more optimal layer, and maybe Lightning should exist on Liquid, and it's possible. We've spoken about in the past, I think drive chains are a good idea as soon as we can get mining to be more decentralized. And again, God bless the Stratton V2 people. But personally, I still want off-chain scaling, and I want high fees on-chain to really secure on-chain. Yeah.
How do you score the layer if you can't afford the exit cost to on-chain?
What, to the drive chains?
For any layer. You always have the problem where the fees rise to a point that they exclude the people on the layer. And
Yeah.
they exclude their ability to
Well, this is it. So we're all used to operating on layer 1, aren't we? And then we want to continue to operate on layer 1. And if that's the choice which everyone wants, then maybe we just increase block size and we do some fancier transaction stuff so we can squeeze more data through a transaction. But
we've gone into, we've deviated from the initial concept of what we're discussing here, because, John, you're pushing more towards, is any upgrade a thing we do at all, rather than how fast do we do them? Because I want to be really clear here. The things I find lamentable about SegWit and Taproot do not in any way mean that I regret those things. What I regret is the inability to address unexpected results of those things. But SegWit and Taproot, SegWit is definitely a fantastic change that was necessary. Some elements of it, as I say, I find regrettable, but I would not turn back the clock and do it. I would just change some ways about how it happened. And Taproot, I believe, will demonstrate itself. Like the idea of, it's not all there yet, it just hasn't.
But that's imaginary. You can't do that.
No, it's not imaginary. Whether I fix the problems in retrospect, going forward, or whether I anticipate them in the first place, amounts to the same thing. You can still put safeguards on what's going on with Taproot now, and you can still, you can still limit what's. I mean, the main issue with dancing around here is the insertion of arbitrary data and turning nodes into cloud storage, in a way that no one signed up for. You can do stuff like that in retrospect. The reason it's lamentable is because no one caught what would happen with SegWit and Taproot beforehand and said, let's let's deal with this before it becomes a problem, and then we don't need to deal with idiots thinking it's censorship.
So
it's just the thing being designed properly in the first place. And
Sjors?
If I can address that. So as far as I can tell, SegWit increased the block size to 4 megabyte. At that point, 4 megabyte spam was possible, foreseeable, and SegWit was designed in a way that spam, if it started to happen, would not consume infinite CPU resources. Because the naive scaling way that Bitcoin Cash, for example, used, although I think they tweaked it, but the naive way to scale Bitcoin was to just multiply everything by 4, and then you have all these quadratic problems. So, for example, there is a known vulnerability that you can make a block that takes an hour to validate on a Raspberry Pi. Had that been done like in the naive way, that might have been 4 hours or 16 hours. I haven't run the numbers. So I think people think that Taproot cost ordinals, but as far as I can tell, you could have done them on SegWit. It's just that somebody saw Taproot and then figured out how to do them. It somehow it triggered their imagination, but they would have done it on SegWit if their imagination had been triggered earlier. And this type of spam, I prefer to call it spam as well, but it goes back to the op return wars. We shouldn't rehash all of Giacomo Zucco's talk here, but yeah. The other point is Taproot gave us music, and music is being used by Phoenix, for example, to give you much better, or slightly better privacy.
Yeah. Ledger came out with support just recently.
Yes, so I would not say that Taproot has not proven itself, though of course not everybody is using those tools.
Can I just champion how good this is for a second? There are people that need help with self-custody, and they use multi-sig solutions. So you have things like Casa, and you have Unchained Capital. I think still does it with the Vault and all. Yes, and these are amazing, but they're privacy disasters because you need someone always to sign off on every transaction you do, which means you never have any expectation of privacy. But this is a necessary element of self-custody for some people. So, I've dealt with widows before whose husband died and they have a Casa account, and the only reason we could figure it all out is because of a third party like that. So blinded multi-sig, this thing which Taproot is going to facilitate, is amazing because you can have that third party, but they don't have access to the information about what it is they're signing, so you still get that redundancy there, and a diminished degree of responsibility about what you're doing with your keys, but you don't need someone's permission, and it doesn't open you up to surveillance, right? So this is like having big data, Gmail and all that stuff handling your email for you, but they don't know any of your content, and they don't know the timing of all the metadata around what you do. That's fantastic. And that's a Taproot thing. So again, like my disillusionment with the current state of Bitcoin, I really don't want it to come across as I'm saying, let's not do any more upgrades, or upgrades need to be done with some arbitrary time frame. It's more just about, can we raise the general understanding around what's good and what isn't, what's congruent with Bitcoin as it's been and what's incongruent, and try and make Bitcoin remain what it is in a changing landscape.
I think it's important to foresee what Bitcoin will become. So it's like, do we want to accept that in 10 years' time or 20 years' time that the majority of people won't have like an on-chain footprint, that they'll exist completely off-chain on some other layer somewhere? Or do we want people to still have access to it in a reasonable way with reasonable fees? And then we just need to figure out if that's where we want to go, then we just need to tackle the immediate problems. And whatever we do, there's going to be unknown repercussions to anything that's implemented. But I think inaction is more dangerous.
One other point I would add, I think, Sjors, you were able to touch on this as well, is even if the code were to stay mostly the same, let's say with maintenance and bug fixes, mining incentives may change over time because of the subsidy coming down and the transaction fees part going up. I know, Sjors, you had some comment on this as well.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where you want to go with this, but basically one thing I've observed is, you have Stratum v2, which tries to push people to make their own block templates, which is great, but then you also have transaction accelerators, and so people, that creates an incentive to have very few pools, because which accelerator are you going to use? And I don't know how that's going to play out. That's one interesting thing. At least Stratum v2 gives people the option to do this, even if this pressure might be the other direction. And the other thing that I think is interesting is the negative energy prices that might become the norm, where like you're not competitive unless you get paid 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and your mining revenue might only be 1 cent per kilowatt hour spent. And so your incentives are mostly to please the energy incentives and very little to please the Bitcoin network incentives, which we don't know the game theory for.
Well, it's playing out right now, and it's pretty ugly.
But there's nothing, at least at the moment, there's no specific soft fork that would fix that problem. But it's going to be interesting to watch. And you always have to consider the possibility that the whole experiment just doesn't work, right? I don't want to go full blue mat here, but it's a possibility. And sometimes I would then say it can be good to just wait and see. Like sometimes you do nothing, and you kind of wait until you do actually have a plan that is good, rather than rush every little fix you can think of. Just you could throw the kitchen sink, for example, the spam problem. Depending on how much you care about it, you might propose some really quick soft fork that kills the current form of ordinals, and then 2 days later they come up with another form of ordinals, because the Bitcoin soft fork development is on a time scale of years, maybe in an emergency weeks.
Well, but that was the approach. They would always, the spammers themselves gave us a soft fork client because they know that's not how you approach spam. You don't, like if you get an email from a Nigerian scammer, you don't change the way SMTP works to deal with it. You deal with it on a higher level. And you make it, because that's the only realistic way to fight spam, and that's the history of spam filtration in Bitcoin was never consensus level. It was always, default.
Yeah, you always do it at the
mempool
policy level, but then you get all these custom transaction accelerators, and standardness doesn't exist anymore. Other than you can, mining pools know that they should not accept any transaction. I think Marapool was the example where they had this super accelerator, and people called them immediately saying, hey, you realize that people could make these 1 hour validation transactions. Right, but they knew that, but some other pool might not.
But this was a good example. Like, it was something that was conceptually opposing to what Marapool first did that pissed everyone off with OFAC compliance. But actually, when you look deep into it, it's exactly the same thing. So on the one hand, with OFAC compliance, they're saying, even though the entire P2P layer has found these UTXOs being spent as totally valid, we're not going to include them in blocks because of some arbitrary censorship criteria given by a government blacklist.
There's a monetary incentive to not mine these things of $1 trillion at
exactly.
time.
The naive idea that there's money here, and if I don't put the transaction in the block, then someone else will, and I'm at an economic disadvantage. Where my lawyer has just said we saved $10 million by complying with this government blacklist.
Yep.
Like, Bitcoin exists in the real world, not in a vacuum. But the point is,
the off-chain fees are very high for some things. Yeah.
But when you flip it the other way up, doing what they're doing now with Slipstream is exactly the same disrespect of, rather than saying the nodes are fine with these transactions and we're going to exclude them from blocks, instead now they're saying the nodes have explicitly said we don't want this stuff in blocks, and they're saying, well, we've gone out of band to add them to blocks. It's the same disrespect of nodes that is reminiscent of the shitcoin culture and influx that Shitcoin magazine have brought into Bitcoin, saying, oh, it's good, it's going to help everyone adopt Bitcoin. And in reality, it always comes at the same expense, and that defines the entire shitcoin space, which is nodes don't really matter. And if they're there, they're an abusable resource that we don't really need to care about. That is the mentality, right?
The only question is, what do you want to do about it? Because, I mean, I share some of these concerns, but ultimately, Bitcoin seems to be about incentives, or at least it's a lot easier to fix things by creating the right incentives rather than to go on Twitter.
These concepts of spam are total nonsense. Calling it disrespecting, this is all subjective, personal perspectives on
spam
things.
is subjective. That is agreed
the way
upon.
that Bitcoin protects itself from spam is having a fee rate.
No,
and that's
spam
it.
is not free in any protocol, in any context. That is an absolute nonsense.
It's the only
Sorry,
throttle
guys.
we have.
Sorry, guys. I think we are going to have to call it, but I think it was an educational panel. We didn't necessarily solve all the world's problems, but everyone, please put your hands together, and thank you to our panelists, John, Ben, Mechanic, and Sjors.
Thanks, Stephan.
Thank you.